Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. So today we're going to have a guest that I've known for quite a long time. John Gruchy actually took your seat when you graduated from grad school up there in the University of Tennessee. I took over your seat about that same time.
Yeah.
So we didn't quite overlap that much. I think maybe a semester or so we overlapped in grad school, but I've known you ever since and have always appreciated your knowledge, particularly on habitat management and early succession and those kinds of topics, and have always, appreciated that knowledge and reach out to you commonly to try to get more of it from you. So I appreciate you taking some time to come on the show. You want to tell the audience maybe a little bit about your background and what you do now?
Sure, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, man. I remember. I think you started your first field season when I was leaving. So that was about. Mm-hmm. And that was probably in like 2007 or so. But I actually got my undergraduate degree at Mississippi State in wildlife science, and then got a master's degree at University of Tennessee and worked under Craig Harper, which I'm sure the audience will be familiar with Craig. But most of my research in the past and most of my work before I really started to work for the state agency, and I've been with Department of Wildlife in Mississippi since 2007 as a private lands biologist, and then now I'm the private lands coordinator. I've been the coordinator now for 8 or 10 years. But most of my work, my background has been in habitat management, prescribed burning, and specifically related to bobwhite management, and also community restoration. We do a lot of prairie work. We do a lot of long leaf, short leaf, upland pine stuff. So we do a little bit of restoration work, but I've been working with private landowners now for 16 years. We average, the individual biologist averages 70 site visits a year, between 70 and 80. Have a variety of different cover types throughout the state, but most of my work has been in North Mississippi. So that's pretty much it. And then, like I said, I've been somewhat of I've hunted turkeys poorly since I was in high school, I guess. Where I grew up,
relate to that.
Oh no, where I grew up, we did not have just tons of them, but I do have the distinction of having killed a turkey on Gulsby National Wildlife Refuge, which I would put that bird against anybody's. And then, do a little bit of turkey hunting, but it's one of those things I guess you don't have to be good at to enjoy. So I'll continue to enjoy, but not be prolific.
If I had to be good at everything I do to enjoy it, I wouldn't have much enjoyment in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where would I go?
Sure.
Yeah. So one of the reasons we wanted to have you on, John, is we've been getting a lot of feedback from listeners talking about, they haven't really noted any major changes habitat-wise to the places they hunt, frequent, own, whatever. Marcus and I have responded to a lot of those listeners in various means, but I think a big issue with that is sometimes they don't exactly know what they're looking for. They don't view the landscape in the same way. So we were hoping to have you on to kind of talk us through that and some situations that you've seen before and or that are common across properties. And then we were talking a little bit before we hit the record button, and it sounds like you also brought with you some data on some large scale changes as well that have happened across the landscape.
Sure. Yeah. And I'd be glad to talk about that. Again, from the bobwhite standpoint, we were kind of joking before we started recording. Been in the bobwhite world for a while, and we've been griping about that. Was griping about landscape change in the 30s, and Leopold and all those guys.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you get to the 60s and 70s, and everybody's in the bobwhite world was really freaked out. And we finally, for the bobwhite plan, they just had to say, oh, it's too much change. We're going to have to set a baseline of 1980. And, that's what we went forward with. So it's kind of just now catching up to the wild turkey, like you guys had talked about from a science standpoint. But overall, it's easy for us in our careers and our jobs when we deal with this stuff every day. It's in our face, and we're the way we interact with the land is perhaps a little different than your average landowner, particularly the landowner that has owned a tract of land or lived on a tract of land their entire life. Or since they were young, and they have different memories. It's hard to separate kind of your emotions for a piece of land and your memories, your history to what's going on, not only even on that piece of property, but at the landscape scale. So when we talk with landowners, again, that's not something you want to come in and make these big accusations on, but essentially when they have questions, we can kind of talk through it and get some of their opinions, their feelings. And, I was sharing with you guys, some specific anecdotes. We'll tell stories and talk about, so tell me about what you guys used to do with the land when Pepaw had it. And I'll tell you, our land, I have land in, my family has land in Warren County, 160 acres or so. And my great-great-grandfather, my great-grandfather made a living on that land by having vegetable crops. He grew basically what we would call a truck patch now. They didn't call it that then. And he logged on the side, and he had hogs, and he had they grew corn in the bottom, and all those things. So you had to hedge your bets back then, right? Because if any one of those things didn't work out, you still needed to have a lifeline. So clearly, when you start talking about those kind of things, well, where's the hogs? Well, we hadn't had hogs in forever. We hadn't had all those things. And one in particular landowner that stood out to me was kind of funny. It was an older gentleman. And he said, of course, nothing's changed, but we used to have quail when I was little, and now we don't anymore. And so, we were riding through the property, and I'd ask him, so right now, this pasture, how was that when you were little? And he thought for a minute, and he said, well, that used to be the old soybean hayfield. We used to hay soybeans, and we actually would have sarisa every now and then. We'd hay sarisa. And then he said, we would graze, Daddy would run pigs here, and, all this. We had molasses, sorghum, we grew molasses, and we did this, and we did that. Then we go to the next place, and we talked about this and that. So what was this like when you were a boy? And when he thought through all those things, when you kind of tell stories, and that's how our minds work, right? We kind of have these internal narratives. When you talk through it, he said, well, I guess it has changed. And he said, but I'll tell you something. We had skinny cows back then, and I don't like that. I can't see a cow's hip. We're going to have to keep what we're doing, with this cattle production. And so, of course, the change was that now all the pastures were non-native forages, which those weren't even available till the 60s and 70s from a plant material standpoint. They're all fertilized with inorganic fertilizer that wasn't available till the 60s or 70s. If you read the history of the TVA projects, in central, the whole Mid-South, they put all that stuff together to build bombs. And when they got done building bombs, they said, what are we going to do with all this nitrogen? Like, oh, we can put it on, we can fertilize things. So that changed the way we did agriculture just right there. Some big ticket stuff. The other thing we have good stories with some of these old timers. What about dairy? Oh yeah, they used to be dairy in every county. There's a dairy, and there was a milk co-op, and they'd come around and pick the milk up. Like, all right, well, how many dairies we got anymore? We ain't got none. We ain't had dairies in 20 years. So these little things and things like having that sounds small, but dairy production is completely different than cow-calf operations or a lot of the stuff that we've got going on now. From a forestry standpoint, you talk through it and say, how did they used to log? And you talk about the logging equipment they had back then and the different ways that they managed forests. Every one of these old tracks, funny story, in Itawamba County, Northeast Mississippi, I was on a track and, we're riding through as a new landowner. He had just bought it. And we got to looking at the woods. I said, man, this is terraced. They terraced all this through here. It was forest, big trees, 50-year-old pines. I said, man, they terraced all this with a mule and a slip. Them were different people back then. We can't do that now. And so they had terraced all that. They were growing cotton on hillsides in Itawamba County, and that was back when they had when they had bobwhites. And, you talk through that with some folks. These old cemeteries, man, you ride through a property and see cemeteries everywhere. Man, there was a community here, and they all had a backyard with a garden and a hedgerow and all these kind of things. And there's no community here anymore. There's just a cemetery. So, when you start talking through some of those things with landowners, they kind of go, "Oh yeah, I guess you're right. There has been some change." And we were telling a funny story. The sprawl. We've changed the way we live on the landscape. We used to be dispersed, and now those communities are just cemeteries. And I tell the story when I was a boy. The Walmart was on the edge of town, and I can go back to the town I grew up in, and there's 4 buildings that used to be a Walmart. Because Walmart keeps wanting to move to the edge of town, right? They're going. Now the one building's a Lowe's and the other one is a bowling alley or something. I don't know, but you get the point. It's definitely changed, particularly when you look at urbanization, sprawl, all those things. I mean, those are things we can see. I can't even recognize the places now that I haven't been in 10 years. You go back and it's completely changed. So, just a lot of it. Just if you sit down and really think about it, there's been some very, very significant changes. And like we were talking about, it's easy to kind of wrap your mind around it, or easier maybe with a bobwhite, a critter that we've had at, we've been able to track that decline. And you can look at some other critters, grassland birds. We use loggerhead shrike and grasshopper sparrow, some of these other birds that are fairly, they're migratory, but short distance migrants. And you can see declines in their populations that coincide with that land use. It's a lot more difficult with wild turkey because they were eliminated from the landscape, essentially only in small pockets. And then we start to look at when those birds were restocked, when they peaked, and what's going on with those population dynamics. So it gets a lot more muddy with the wild turkey. And so I think that's another difficulty some people have.
Yeah, no question. It's also interesting if you think about those other species that you named. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap in demands from a habitat standpoint, but also because of the history of wild turkey, they were getting restocked, and we're seeing these tremendous increases in abundance, while these other ones are starting their decline or already declining. But they, a lot of those other species didn't almost go extinct from, from market hunting or whatever at the turn of the century. So that is kind of interesting. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective before. That we were kind of thinking everything was good with wild turkeys because we were in that restoration phase.
That's right.
But that was when we were starting to see symptoms of this landscape change in habitat and land uses that may not provide the most ideal situation. We started seeing those signs in some of these other species that were still abundant on the landscape at the time.
Absolutely. The same thing with white-tailed deer. That same fellow that, I'll tell you the stories are all about bobwhites because they remember shooting bobwhites. My daddy hunted bobwhites, in Southwest Mississippi. But he'll tell the story they hunted bobwhites because there wasn't nothing else. There wasn't. If somebody saw a deer track, you called everybody in the county and told them about the deer track. So again, all those things confound how the stories we tell ourselves. How we view the world.
Yeah, John, in the episode that aired last week, Marcus and I discussed a lot of landscape changes, and one of the strong focal points of that conversation was on conversion of agriculture to pine plantation. A lot of that was done under the CRP program.
Sure.
And I even mentioned when we were talking about that I recalled a conversation that you and I had a couple years ago. I think we were all up at Buffalo Ridge for that get together that we had up there. And we were talking about this within the context of turkeys. And would you go into a little bit more detail about that as far as, kind of the history of when those fields were converted to pine and, how those stands have been managed, coming up to the modern day?
Sure, man. And again, that's one of those more complex issues thinking about it. But, I'm sure most of the listeners know what the Farm Bill is, but basically we did not have the Farm Bill that we have now. Now, we've always had agricultural legislation going back to FDR and all that. But we had the kind of current framework that we have now for the Farm Bill wasn't until 1985. And one of the big functions of the Farm Bill was taking marginal and highly erodible land out of production. So, you do that out west and we can go and see these vast grasslands where they've, just basically walked away from it in some cases and allowed it to come up in that native prairie again, short grass prairie, tall grass prairie, depends on the state. They might have sown it down to smooth brome. It just depends on when you enrolled. And in Mississippi, it's very interesting. The early enrollments for CRP, we did not have the plant materials maybe that we have now. And so a lot of the old timers, when they enrolled land in CRP, they sowed it to wheat or ceresia or some annual crop and just let the grassland come back. But the probably the most popular option, and really not in the 80s, but in the early 90s farm bills, in most of the Deep South was to plant agricultural fields, poor producing agricultural fields, to loblolly pine if they were suited for pine, and that just had even now. So that early '90s, daylight to dark. I respect those guys that put all those trees in the ground, but if you think about it, maybe it wasn't perhaps such a great idea from a market standpoint to stick a couple 800,000 acres in my state in pine trees in 1 year, because now we're trying to sell some of that stuff and it's all the same age class, which is difficult. But from a wildlife standpoint at that time in that mid 90s, from a turkey standpoint, that was when we were peaking coming back from the restocking. And also, if you think about it, a freshly planted into loblolly pine agricultural field for that 4 or 5, 6 or 7 years after it's been planted, it's excellent brood rearing and nesting cover later on in that rotation. So, we had this huge, really massive landscape scale addition of nesting and brood rearing cover in that mid 90s timeframe that kind of, I don't know that, we couldn't say that was the reason for that peak in turkey harvest in the mid 90s. But, it couldn't have hurt. And certainly when we had turkeys, new populations, we weren't dealing with all those density dependent things that we've talked about now. Perhaps, I mean, I can't say that for certain. You had all this huge change. The other, there's people here listening. I can hear them. They're saying, and that was when we didn't have fire ants, and we didn't have this, and we could go on and talk about the predator thing. I was going to bring up, in '89. We peaked in raccoon harvest, with so many 400, I think I said 42,000 raccoons reported harvested in the late 80s. And now it's like way less than 20,000. The fur market falls out. There's all these different things. And it's just like with the Bob White story. Sometimes it gets a little frustrating. When we do research, and you guys do research, I don't do research anymore, but we like to have a control, and then we like to fix everything else and wiggle just one thing, right? We want to pull one string at a time. We can't do that. That it was not one string at a time that was pulled on this situation. All these things confound, and they're all going on, going on at the same time or similar time frames, and so it's really difficult to tease all that out. But yeah, the CRP deal, and that carries on even to today. So we're looking at enrollments of WRP, bottomland hardwoods. We're going back in and reforesting some of the land that was cleared in the 70s. And so, again, I don't know. I think I digressed a little bit on all that.
So that's fine. So what is the fate of a lot of that CRP pine today? How's it? What condition has it wound up in Mississippi?
So that's a good question. So the original CRP was, and again, they kept it's carried on. It's not something that just stopped all of a sudden. But most of it, the way the program was laid out, they tried to take in that highly erodible, low quality ag land, and so a lot of that got enrolled in the first couple of farm bills. So really now we're to the point of just bits and pieces of acreage. Smaller tracts and some of the odds and ends that are going into the farm bill programs. But that stuff that enrolled early, it's a variety of different things that have gone on. And, it's funny, it depends on commodity prices and all that, but most of that stuff was in 10-year contracts. And so a lot of it re-enrolled. So they got 20 years out of that. And some of it re-enrolled for another contract for 30 years. So ideally, around year 15, we would have thinned a lot of that pine, or the landowner would have been able to thin a lot of that pine. Now, a lot of that got done, but when we got to about 2008, remember the housing market went pooh, it kind of all that fell off. And so we were getting $16 a ton pulpwood, and in the course of that would have been high. That would have been really high pulpwood at that time. So 2007, 2008, you could get I'm going to say $11, $12 pretty regular for pulpwood, and so and they needed the pulpwood. We were taking it in. In the course of a short order, the market changed, and then we had this glut of stuff coming ready for thinning. So now a lot of that stuff is not able to be thinned. It's not able to be cut. In my geography, we had a big mill in Cortland, Alabama that, after the financial meltdown, it shut down. And that was, I think, 200,000 tons of wood a week that was going to that mill. And now that's still on the landscape. That stuff doesn't have a market. So, it goes through that whole land.
Like
what's that now,
for the thinning, it literally won't pay its way off the land to be thinned.
Yeah, well, no, they just don't need it. They don't need it. It's like we're kind of in the what's another fad? I don't know, pet rock or whatever. They're probably still sitting on the shelf somewhere, right? Remember, think of any fad you can imagine. Once it's utility, there's only when was the last time you wrote a letter and mailed it and put a stamp on it? We don't use paper like we used to. If you look at global demand, the only thing that's going up is Amazon boxes. So, and that's like 10% of the market, cardboard and fluff paper, so diapers and stuff like that. As the developing nations discover diapers, that's going to build, that's like, again, 10% of the market. Newsprint, there's only, I think, maybe 4 or 5 mills in North America that still make newsprint. I mean, I haven't held a newspaper in my hand. I get the weekly, I get the grocery newspaper. That's it. How many people got newspapers delivered to their house? All right. So they're, again,
everybody.
So all that stuff has changed. It's been significant. And again, none of that happens in a closet. All these things are going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you said that a lot of that timber got enrolled, it was the early 90s, I think is what you said. Like, so basically when they're getting to that first thin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was when we had this huge influx.
Yeah.
But all of that essentially got to thinning time in the mid to late 2000s. And then when that market was kind of gone.
Yeah.
So then I guess, presumably for the, since over that last decade, or I guess,
almost
15
2
years
decades.
now?
Yeah, 15 years.
So now has that essentially been the case?
So
since 2007 or 8 or 9 or whatever?
What happened is we had a ubiquitous pulp and paper market in the Deep South, and now it's regional. Now, if you were in certain areas, you can get thin and done. If you're in Northwest Mississippi, you're going to have a hard time. North Alabama is going to have a hard time. Parts of Middle Tennessee are going to have a really hard time. It's coming down to proximity to mill. You made a comment, can it pay its way to the mill? That even takes out of consideration the procurement process. So we have less loggers. The average age of a procurement logger is going up 1 year every year. Nobody gets into logging, right? It's this huge. The loggers' kids even go to college. To go do something else. They don't want their kids to log. So, and I'm joking there, by the way. I've got some great logging, friends and logging families and all that. Didn't mean to be any way negative to those. And we need those. I'm griping that we don't have enough. We need more procurement folks. So that whole chain is really experienced huge shakeups since the mid 90s, but certainly in the last 2 decades, like you guys talked about. So I'm sure there are people listening that have tried to sell pine pulpwood and had a hard time. And we'll get hiccups in the market. We can move softwood. There'll be. So, they need some amount of soft pulpwood. They need some amount of mat board pallets. When they go in and put new gas pipelines in, we can sell those. When they go and replace railroad cross ties, we'll have a hiccup in the market where we can sell rough hardwood, those kinds of things. But I don't think we're going to see that. So the decision-making process in the mid-90s when all those people enrolled that stuff into pine, that was a good bet. You know what I mean? You think about it, you're telling me I can get an annual rental payment to not kill myself trying to plant this marginal ag land, and I can plant a pine tree on it that one day I'll get to cut and make money off of. So, I'm in. So
retirement plan.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a great bet at that time, and it's just everything everything changed.
Yeah. Well, another thing we talked about it a little bit right before the show started, but how has that affected just forest communities across the state? Like, how has the composition across the landscape of forests changed?
Yeah, so the kind of the pine deal, and I don't want to keep hitting pine timber. I work with landowners all the time, and I recommend people plant pine timber. I'm not. We don't want to make a villain out of
Right.
pine timber, pine production. That is a huge need. It's a sustainable industry. It's a great industry. We rely on that industry to get wildlife management done. So I don't want to come off too hard on all that. But since you asked, the whole I pulled some FIA numbers basically, and since 1994, we've had about a 70% increase in pine. Now it just is listed as loblolly pine forest. It doesn't say plantation, so there could be some natural loblolly pine forest. And we've had about a 40% decline in mixed pine hardwood forest. So if you think about it, back when Pepau had the land, that was the native forest type. If you go back when Leopold visited in 1927, he says mixed pine hardwood is the native upland forest type throughout the state, and he said it's 85% of the landscape. As a matter of fact, when he was describing, he said half of that 85% of the landscape he estimated burned every year. Now that's not he didn't measure that. He was estimating that. He spent 6 weeks here, so I mean it wasn't just a day drive through. But
yeah. Well, it's still a pretty good indication that a lot of the landscape was mixed pine hardwood, and it got burned a lot.
It got burned a lot, and they used it differently.
And it would have shifted more towards pine if it was burned more often, and then it would have shifted more towards hardwood, maybe even during periods where fire became less frequent for some reason, and that kind of dictated the landscape.
Yeah, and it was heavily. You got to think we weren't bringing in artificial plant material, so it was heavily dictated by site. So these dry, sandy uplands, when we go back and look at the 1830s land surveys, where they were getting the mark trees, the corner trees and whatnot, we get dry, sandy uplands. It's short-leaf pine. You start to grade down into, lurse and silt, and you get hardwood. You're getting post oak and blackjack oak and some of those lesser quality hardwoods that nowadays are going to be selected against. So you just had a more diverse forest simply as a byproduct of the way we use the land. It wasn't intentional.
Yeah. So you said 70% increase in loblolly, 40% decrease in
mixed pine hardwood, and
hardwood.
Everything else has stayed somewhat similar forest since the 90s. We had a vast, prior to the Clean Water Act and whatnot, we had a lot of bottomland hardwood clearing for soybean farming in the 70s, that big soybean kind of revolution, if you will, in the South in the 70s. And that was when a lot of channelization happened. So we talked about that earlier too. In my state, there's no such thing as a crooked creek anymore. They're pretty much replumbed and straightened out. And I know that's true of Alabama. And both you guys have Alabama experience. But we talked about, the Tom Bigby waterway. That's my house. I live about 2 miles from the Tom Bigby. There are more endangered species on that water system than there are anywhere in North America. And they're all aquatic. They're all mussels and fish that require a crooked creek, and that ship kind of sailed. So anyway, those are things to think about. So that forest may still be bottomland hardwood, where it's been channelized, ditched, straightened out, but it's probably not exactly the same kind of forest and has the same ecological function as it did through the thousands of years that turkeys have adapted to use it. So, that's a consideration.
Yeah, that channelization just really changes the hydrology of the system, which is hard to see visually. But it may have effects on the way the plant communities function for sure.
Then the other thing we kind of mentioned a little bit was the changes in farming. So I talked about acreages and all that, but we talked a little bit about cattle production and how they used to use maybe more annual forages, and now we've moved to more perennial grasses. But that affected the row crops. Have been the way we do row crop has changed in the last. Well, heck, it's been changing constantly, but certainly significant changes since the 70s. I pulled some numbers. So average soybean production per acre in Mississippi in 1980, average statewide soybean production was 21 bushels in 1980. In 2015, it's 46 bushels. So how did that happen? How did we do that? That's great. We're feeding the world now. That's our chief export. I'm glad that we can export that crop, not shading the farmers in any way, shape, or form.
But, so just to be clear, John, that on a per acre basis, we've more than doubled the productivity of soybeans on that acre.
And just looking at soybeans, which to me is a little more consistent crop, if that makes any sense. So, if you just look at soybeans, we've more than doubled. Hats off, by the way, to the folks who are feeding the world. I'm not, again, knocking that. But what are the consequences of doubling that production? So if you look at Bill Palmer's dissertation in North Carolina, he says, the weed-free, bug-free crops may or may not be affecting bobwhite. So they went and, there's been studies where they've submerged bobwhite eggs. Everybody's been griping about pesticides forever. The direct impacts of the pesticides appear to be short-term. But when we get these Roundup Ready crops that are weed-free, that lasts season long. So we have a decline in invertebrate abundance in those crops that may or may not have been buggy in the 80s because they were weedy and not as productive, and it goes back to the skinny cow story, how much, what are we balancing out here? So
again, we talked about that.
I feel really bad. I feel like I'm being super negative. Like, this is like,
things have changed. Yeah. And, feels negative sometimes. Yeah. It's negative when it means less turkeys. So.
Right. And we talked about also in this same vein, the intensification of pine silviculture.
Yeah.
So I think the statistic was, Marcus, and maybe you can help me remember, that in the 50s and I think it was 50s and 60s, they were producing about a quarter of the board feet per acre that they're producing now.
Yeah, it was a dramatic change. And if you think I'm going to remember the detail, you're wrong.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, we've increased the number of board feet per acre like fourfold since the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. Great accomplishments from a
absolutely
productivity standpoint, but there are consequences to that. So with the agriculture, so some of that is probably genetics of the plants themselves and the planting techniques, but also some of it's probably associated with the advances in herbicides, and pesticides, and also the fertilizer.
Yeah. So all those things obviously come into play. If you look, even planting dates. So like we used to planting and harvesting, man. Like, so when I was a kid, I even remember this, there'd be beans in the field. Much later on, corn wouldn't. Now, when I was a kid, when I was a kid story, I remember dove hunts. We feel like we used to kill doves, and everybody so the doves get left out of this conversation. But now corn gets planted so early, and they got it so good and so dialed in. I swear they'd like time it to cut the corn in the whole big landscape like 2 weeks before dove season, and it's like, oh well, okay, yeah, there they went. But I swear there was standing corn in dove season when I was a kid. You know what I'm saying? So
I remember that.
Yeah, those types of things are there's impacts to that. That seems small. Those are the types of things though that make big impacts on production. They get early planting dates. They get beans that can produce. They can match the beans to the site a lot better. All these different things, and then of course the genetics you talked about, the weed-free, bug-free has a big impact. The being able to be, precision fertilization, all those things, all goes in.
Yeah, and we've talked some about this, and maybe it'll be a good topic for you to shed some light on. But the implications of that weed-free, I mean, that's those weeds. A lot of those are forbs, annual forbs, right? And those are the things that we're associating with high insect production, which are pests now to, some of them are to the agricultural plants. So, but the structure also from a predator standpoint or exposure standpoint, it's probably far better when you had a soybean patch that was full of a bunch of native forb weeds.
Yeah, and I, again, don't want to beat the dead horse too hard, but yeah, like I said, Bill Palmer's dissertation, really quantified a lot of that in North Carolina. It was very interesting to read. The anecdotes, I got an older farmer that I worked with. He grew up farming cotton, and we were talking about all this, and he said he remembers when Bassagran came out in the '60s. I mean, that was a long time ago, and he thought, "Oh my God, I don't have to hoe the cotton." They were literally hoeing and using field cultivators. You can't even buy a field cultivator anymore, but I mean, that was the weed control at that time. They were literally row cultivating, which was not super effective. But you want to talk about bare ground, is making that. And then, of course, we had the turn rows. If you look now, we're much more precise with our equipment. So tractors don't even have to turn around like they used to, right? They used to talk about turn rows. I mean, there's not much of a turn row anymore. And I do remember that when I was a kid, you used to ride down the turn rows to get from one field to the other. And now you just got to go right through the middle. And they're just you know what I mean? If you look, there's just that one beat down path right through the middle of the beans, and you used to drive all the way around, had 18 gates you had to go through. You know what I mean? You were driving on the turn rows. It ain't like that no more. So, I mean, again, people listening, think about the gates, man. Remember when you were little, nobody wanted to ride. Everybody wanted to get in the middle, right? You didn't want to get the gates.
Yeah.
So
that's the one time you want to ride in the middle.
That's right. Yeah. So it's real, but at the same time, that genie's out of the bottle, so you've got to think about what are we going to do going forward to try to cope with changing land use.
John, what have you seen? Because I feel like you touched on this briefly earlier, but we also haven't spent much time on it either. What have you seen as far as the loss of bottomland hardwoods?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think a lot of that occurred in the 70s. A lot of what we have left now is too wet to be anything else. So they're going to bottomland hardwood. If you look at FIA data, very small changes. If anything, afforestation. So WRP has come in the 3 states, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama. We're up to like 800, maybe 900,000 acres of WRP enrolled. So that's a significant footprint coming back into at least the Delta. I think
what's the time frame when a lot of that
much more slow than the CRP in the 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. A lot of that WRP enrollment. So that's really slowed down. We're going to see that, but a lot of that WRP enrollment would have been in the early 2000s to late 2000s. Big enrollments there, and so you see, a lot of
those hardwoods are 20 years old now.
Yeah, so those are getting ready to be in need of management. We actually saw kind of a bobwhite bump in parts of the Delta when they enrolled a lot of that stuff in hardwood. And if you look, we don't even have. So they enrolled so much hardwood at that time. We had all these hardwood nurseries. We couldn't get trees. I remember a little bit of that. We had this hard time. Now all those nurseries are closed. We don't even have. So that's how much reforestation we're doing now. We're down to 1 or 2 nurseries, and we can't get trees. That just shows, the whole changing, how everything changes. But so now I guess what's happening with the agriculture is, they're precision leveling a lot of that land, and that'll never be reforested. That high quality precision leveled land will always be in agriculture, which is good. Obviously I like to eat. So, there's that. But from a bottomland hardwood standpoint, I don't think we're necessarily losing acreage, but you got to think about the function and the management of those systems. So a lot of that, a great deal of it, just on the FIA side of things, is going to be in protected lands. It's going to be public land, that kind of thing, and then that's not protected land is probably going to be less actively managed, if you will. So you're going to have mainly we're down to the wet spots. So it's going to be different, tough to operate in. But still, very, very important on the landscape. I think Adam might have touched on this, but we did did some projects with Mississippi State, and we looked at how important that hardwood was on the landscape. Even if we keep roughly 30% of the landscape, and that being like at the 15,000 acre scale, roughly 30% of that landscape being in hardwoods was enough to make an impact on turkey harvest. So, or measurable impact on turkey harvest. So, there's still that hardwood component is still critical. And I think, the SMZs we talked about, production pine, I can go into some landscapes like Kemper County where we still have a really strong turkey population, but that whole landscape is production pine. It's just got SMZs, all those streamside management zones. So it's got that 30% hardwood kind of integrated and interspersed throughout the landscape and still being managed. But the bigger blocks of hardwood are where we're probably seeing the most change now, just in terms of management.
So do you think that Kemper County example is common across the landscape? Or do you think that there are a lot of areas that are narrowing SMZs to cutting up closer to streams and losing some of that hardwood component?
I think that it depends. I think that so what has happened, we're not doing the big conversions anymore. I think all that is kind of locked in. Does that make sense? Like that,
Yeah.
Things are settling out as to what's going to be what. Now, one of the big conversions we are seeing now is because of the timber markets being kind of depressed, people are converting forest land to pasture. We're seeing, I wouldn't say that's broad scale because the input costs are also going up on that, But at the end of the day, I think most of that is kind of settled into. There was a politician from Mississippi in the 80s that was talking about this, and he said, some of the land wants to grow cows, and some of the land wants to grow trees, and some of it wants to grow crops. And I think we've kind of, that's kind of settling out, right? We're kind of getting to the stuff that's really, really wet is going to be bottomland hardwood. The stuff that, the crooked creeks are going to have their SMCs, and that's pretty much how it is, how it's been laid out. And so now we're just going into those stands and managing the pine and not so much the SMZs.
Gotcha.
Well, what are there any other land use changes that you think are important?
Yeah, so the last one, and you guys will be able to speak to this better than I for the wild turkey, but fire suppression. And that's the last one that I have really on my notes. And that'll lead us into kind of the restoration discussions and whatnot. So fire suppression is really difficult to quantify because we don't have, even today, very good numbers, hard numbers on how much acreage is burned or has been burned. But certainly if you go back, and it depends on the time frame you want to get onto, we talked about that 1927 example. We used to burn the heck out of the whole landscape, maybe arguably too much. And then obviously the 50s and 60s was really that fire suppression southeast wide. Now, I will tell you that Mississippi resisted that a whole lot better than the rest of the southeast. We still got some rebel burners. I was giving a talk in probably 2008 or so in Panola County. And I remember talking about the right to burn, which we're a right to burn state. And somebody said, amen, jumped up. I thought, oh heck, maybe
serious.
He's probably
getting religious about it now.
Yeah, he's probably going to go light something on fire right now. Like I've caused an arson. This is, so overall though, prescribed fire has decreased, and how could it not? I used the Walmart example. It's the tract sizes. One of the farm things I didn't mention. So our farm acres have been fairly stable since the mid 90s, but the average number of farms is going down. So those farms are consolidating. You know what I mean? Memo and Papa's, the kids have moved to town and the land's got to get sold. Well, we've got bigger farmers that are buying on that land, and it's, individual farms are getting larger, even though the land is. And so when that happens, your hedgerows, your fence rows, things like that are impacted. But also, the sprawl affects burning, our forest types, and being converted to pine that, obviously can be burned, but at certain stages doesn't need to be. I'll leave that to you guys to talk about fire and fire suppression and how you guys think that plays into the wild turkey exactly.
Well, I think it certainly is playing a really important role for, when you think about all of these different changes, and then we have some of these land uses in forest that are flammable, but fire doesn't necessarily fit in with the objectives of that land anymore. And I think that could, certainly have a pretty dramatic effect in that scenario. But also with some of the stuff that you're really skilled with early succession, not having that really strong fire component is pretty critical in that scenario as well.
Oh yeah.
John, one thing that you did touch on earlier that I know you have a lot of experience with is working with, just the extent of the coverage of like Bahia grass and Bermuda grass, fescue grass, and trying to battle that. And can you speak a little bit to how prevalent the issue is with landowners that are trying to manage for wildlife objectives, and then maybe share on some success stories that you've had related to that?
Sure. And the not just the non-native pasture grasses, but all this slew of invasive species we've got, Kogan grass and popcorn tree now and all those got to be having, significant negative impacts on a lot of different animals. And that's very regional. If you get to deep South Mississippi, I don't think there's any, you can't find an acre that hadn't got a plant from Asia or Europe. But if you get into North Mississippi, it's very, obviously we've got the fescue belt, the Bermuda grass belt, the Bahia grass belt as you kind of step down in Mississippi. Very prevalent. It's interesting that, common Bermuda was what everybody kind of started with. And that is, you can't, when they drop the nuclear bomb, there's going to be cockroaches in common Bermuda left. So, it cannot be killed by mortal men. But the hybrid Bermuda.
Marcus said you'd say that.
Yeah.
I called it.
In the episode we recorded, the episode we recorded last week, he was like, John's going to say cockroaches in Bermuda.
Yeah.
That'll be the last things left when an asteroid hits Earth.
Oh yeah, that's it. And common Bermuda. It's interesting that they don't like common Bermuda anymore. They want the Tifton and the fancy ones, and those die easy. You could turn your back on those. Talk mean to them, and they give up. But the other problems I guess we have is what do we do with the pasture land when it's not going to be pasture anymore? So I deal with a lot of that. If it's in pasture land and it looks good, the landowners are keeping cows on it. They're managing it for cattle, and that's good. I obviously, like I said, I like to eat beef and all types of products that depend on pasture. But a lot of that was small farms, and now we have this change. So as Gen X is retiring, we're starting to see husband and wife want to move out to the country and have 100, 200 acres, and they want to buy a farm, which ends up having been pasture. And they want to do the guy maybe wants to hunt turkeys and train dogs or something, and the wife wants goats and bees. I don't know. That's kind of the new. I'm just telling you how it is, man. But so then what do we do with that pasture that doesn't want to be pasture anymore, or that they don't want to have as pasture anymore? And that's difficult. So we've had some success. Again, killing common Bermuda is difficult, and I've just kind of learned to. If Craig hears this, he's going to be upset. But I've learned to live with about 1 or 2, 3, much as 5% Bermuda grass still being in an area. But we can kill it down to that coverage with 2 applications of herbicide. I've got a landowner not far from my house right now that actually we killed Bermuda. We didn't plant. We planted maybe 1 or 2 fields with native grass just for kind of aesthetics in an area, but he has seen a noticeable increase in turkeys. He's in a pretty good landscape. And so he's doing a lot of burning. And so, some of the times when we don't hear those success stories, they're not following through with the management. It's a very active management. So, those are the types of things that we're dealing with now, trying to convert some of these non-native pastures. From a turkey standpoint, I think a big part of that is really making a decision on what to do. So if it's bobwhites, that's no question. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to kill this Bermuda grass and we're going to burn it, and we're going to manage for early succession because they got to have it. And for wild turkeys, if I go into a property that's got let's say it's a 500 acre property and it's got 250 acres of open land, do I need that much for that guy to have to manage for turkeys? You know what I mean? He's going to have, if we kill all that 250 acres and start putting it on a fire rotation, that's a significant amount of work. And so now you start thinking like, well, you start having the more difficult questions when you start talking about management. What do you want to do as an individual? How much work are you willing to put into this property? Because again, sometimes we start looking at farm leases. Maybe it's better for to try to find a farmer to go in and farm that Bermuda grass. I'd rather have some type of row crop perhaps than I had Bermuda grass, which is basically a completely negative cover type for everything but a cow. So I don't know. What else you had in mind on some of that? We could talk about
one thing. I know that I'm not asking you to give a recipe or anything. I realize that there's a lot to it, but just in general, I think we probably have a lot of listeners out there that are in a situation where they are concerned about turkeys, and maybe they have some of this pasture, and they're interested in taking part of it and getting it back into early succession. Since you do that all over the place and have done it for a long time and are very skilled, could you kind of walk us through? Let's say they have Bermuda or Bahia or fescue or whatever. You can pick one or maybe give us a little bit about each one.
Yeah,
what does the process look like to get it into something that you're then in maintenance with? With fire or disking or whatever.
Yeah, well, that could be a pretty extensive question. There's a lot of good resources on the internet, but I would say the first step is identifying the problem. What grasses do you have out there? And very seldom in the South, the Mid-South, Deep South, do we have just one of those. We're going to have a Bermuda grass field with fescue in it, or a fescue field with Bermuda grass in it. It's also going to have Johnson grass, and if you're lucky, you'll have Dallas grass, Bahia grass. You might get some, crab. You don't have crabgrass and goosegrass regardless. So,
Vasey's grass.
Yeah, Vasey's grass. Yeah, you get all kinds of fun stuff. So, the first step again is identifying the problem, and once you've decided on a regime to convert. So, am I going to kill the grass? Am I going to try to bring in plant material? Am I going to? How am I going to manage that later on? That kind of gets you into your protocol. And the first step in the protocol is always going to be preparing for herbicide application. And by the way, for those listening, there is no way to get rid of pasture grasses, invasive grasses without using herbicides. Sometimes I think wildlife people get labeled as tree huggers, and they think when I say you're going to have to spray this, and it's going to take like 5 herbicide applications, they go, "Oh, I thought you guys were tree huggers. You didn't like chemicals or whatever." Or I've even heard it the other way. People say they didn't want to use the chemicals, but after a couple of years of fighting that stuff, they're the neck. They want to spray everything then. So, but first step is preparing it. You can either burn. It depends on your recipe, but you can either burn it to prepare for spraying, or hay it if you can. Mowing it is a bad idea. Grazing it if you're able, but that's rare when people are able to graze something. They want.
Can you expand on the mowing real quick? Why is that a bad idea?
Yeah, good point. And we didn't talk about mowing. I guess you guys have probably talked about mowing extensively in other episodes, but we don't like to mow. I have used mowing before to prepare a field because we just have to. But if you have a lot of thatch, a lot of duff, and you mow it, you're just going to lay that thatch on top of the grass that you're trying to spray. And the reason that we're preparing the field for spraying is to try to get increased contact of that herbicide. We do have some herbicides we use that have soil activity, but they're still going to need to contact the plant and get to the soil. And if you have basically a hay cut and laid on top of the ground, that's not going to go very well. So when
you hay it, you're coming in and you're producing hay and getting that thatch out of there.
That's right. So usually the best case scenario is when a landowner has a neighbor that has cows and they say, "Hey, free hay, come here. If you'll bale it, you can have this." And that happens with some regularity. I mean, I'm able to do that in Mississippi. Funny thing, surprising, moving from Tennessee to Mississippi. When I was in Tennessee, that was very hard to find somebody that just had random hay equipment. And in Mississippi, that seems to be a lot more easy and heavy equipment. So when I came to Mississippi, I said, you ought to spray these sweet gums. They're no good. And he's like, "Can I take my dozer and run over them?" I guess you can. Yeah. I mean, if you got a dozer, I mean, there's very few people I work with that don't have a cousin or a buddy that's got a bulldozer or some kind of heavy equipment.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty funny. So that tends to, it depends on your location as to what you'll be able to do to prepare a field for spraying. And the timing of the herbicide application is another big problem. So if you're going to kill Bermuda grass, 9 times out of 10, I'm killing Bermuda grass, or at least there's some Bermuda grass. And so we'll do a spring burn, and then we'll do a July herbicide, May, July herbicide application, probably with imazapyr. And it depends on what we're doing, which herbicide we're going to use, what we're doing after. But I've had reasonably good luck with 2 applications in one growing season of Roundup. If you don't want to use that really heavy imazapyr, I've had bad luck with imazapyr in heavy soils where it kills everything and then nothing grows back. We have to put so much imazapyr out, and it's got soil activity. The only thing that grows back is goldenrod, and then I can't burn it or do anything, and it ticks you off. So again, it's good to have a biologist come out, look at the place, or somebody who knows what they're talking about, come out, look at the place. And
so when you say heavy soil, you mean like a lot of clay in it?
Yeah, man.
So then that extends the soil residual activity.
Yeah. So and then also they don't want to grow grass anyway. High pH. So in my prairie soils, they have really high pH, and they don't want to grow grass anyway. Everybody thinks about a prairie and it's got to be all grass. No, those prairie soils with really high pH, I bet less than half the plant material is grass. Mm-hmm. It's all forbs. And then
Forbland.
Yeah, for sure. So it depends on the soil in the area as to what herbicide exactly you'll use. But if you do a summer herbicide application, you're probably going to have to do 2. Usually that means you're going to spray, then you're going to look, and you're going to wait, and you're going to see what comes up by about August or so. And if we're still getting rain, you can do another herbicide application. If it's dry, we kind of have to wait sometimes till the next year. But I would wait till the next year anyway before I made any further decisions and see what's coming up on that field. I'd say 7 out of 10 times or so, we're going to be able to get good plant material back from the seed bank. I'm just, that's just off the top of my head. And it depends on what the landowner's goals and objectives are. Where we don't get the good plant material back is really where I'm having to use the imazapyr. If we fallow row crop agriculture, if we're able to kill just fescue or able to kill something with just using Roundup, sometimes we can get the good plant material back. And it may take the second growing season before the good plant material really shows up.
Mm-hmm.
But that just all depends.
Just to back up for 1 second, when you say prep the field to spray, and then I've heard you say burn or the haying, are you trying to get the grass to flush, or what are you trying to accomplish when you say prep?
Yeah, all those things. So when you're preparing the field for spraying and you burn it the first time, you're really trying to get all the foulness off, clean it up, be able to have that good contact for the herbicide. By your second application, you're probably trying to burn or do something to try to stimulate the seed bank and see, because there are some things like Sericea lespedeza that don't come up until you tick them off. You got to stick a stick in that anthill, to make those things rear their heads sometimes. And that Sericea, there's certain areas, man, the county, it's funny when you get to know your counties, man. I don't know who was the extension agent in Marshall County that told everybody to plant Sericea lespedeza. But it's like when you leave the borders of a couple of those counties, some of those plants go away, and you think, damn, there had to be a guy that was doing all that. There was some guy that really thought it was good. So anyway, that's neither here nor there, but it just depends on what your goal is. And so then we talked about whether or not you bring plant material to the site. And that's a really good question for wild turkey. From a bobwhite and from a landowner aesthetic standpoint, that's usually what makes that decision for me. How close we are to the barn, and what do they want to see? What do they want it to look like? Because even though I know I've talked to Craig numerous times about this, he doesn't prefer to bring in plant material in most cases, very seldom. We actually have a lot of cases where if the landowner does not like the way that looks, now, yes, you can tell them you got to get over it. But if they don't like the way it looks, they're not going to be committed to managing it. So if we can manage for aesthetics in some of these areas by bringing in pretty wildflowers or a little bit of grass and make it easy on them. And like we were talking about, sometimes we don't get enough grass back into the stand to be able to burn it. I have a lot of problems with that in the prairie. If I don't get enough grass back in there, you're going to have to plant some, because if you can't burn it, trees are going to come in. We're going to have, hackberries pretty bad in the prairie. Green ash is my like arch nemesis in certain soil types because it blows in. Sweet gum in other soil types. Any of those light seeded species. So you got to think about. I'm not just bringing in plant material for wild turkey, for bobwhite. I'm bringing in plant material for that landowner. I'm bringing in plant material for that long term management. So those are the considerations. Sometimes more than just, oh, I've got ragweed here, I don't need to plant anything, right? I've got, ironweed or whatever. It's what is the long-term management.
It seems to me, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, John, but it seems like when Craig is talking about that, he means you often don't need to bring in plant material to create high-quality brooding cover or high-quality nesting or whatever.
Yeah.
But that is quite different than needing to bring in plant material because of the aesthetics of it,
or the long-term management.
Make sure the family.
Yeah. So we have an 80%. An 80% forb cover type is excellent brood rearing cover. Try to burn it. Try to keep that from coming up in trees. Sometimes you've got to.
Where would disking fit into that?
Usually not until a couple years down the road. So it highly depends on the soil types and all that. But and in my prairie soils, I really don't have to disc. They never get aggressive grass. But disking comes in once you've got aggressive grass of any kind. So that Bowen site is a great example. You're familiar with it, and the listeners won't. But it's an example of one where the landowner actually brought in plant material at a low rate, like very low seeding rate of plant material, but he burned it every year because he liked fire, had a bobwhite objective. And in 3 years, we had to, it had to be disked 2 or 3 years because it had just almost immediately got too thick. In other instances, it'll be year 7 or 8 before you have to disc. It's just whatever time frame that grass gets dense enough to where it's no longer meeting your objectives. It's not providing brood rearing cover. It's not providing feeding cover. And usually, that's whenever it gets roughly, eyeballing 50% or greater cover of grass. And the more aggressive grasses tend to be, everybody knows about switchgrass, but broom sedge, man, on some of my soil types, broom sedge is just gonna get you. And the only way to deal with it is disking. That's it.
So aside from cutting back on that grass density, are there ever scenarios where you use disking as your primary disturbance mechanism over fire to maintain that early succession?
Yeah. I mean, where they can't burn, landowner can't burn. We've used disking. So I'll tell you what we try to do in that case, and people are going to disagree with this, and that's fine. But where we can't burn and we use a lot of disking, what we try to do is more of a rotational annual planting. And I personally like that for turkeys. I see them use the crud out of it to where you can disc even whole fields and sow into brown top millet and then fallow that field for 2 or 3 years, but move that system around the property, if that makes any sense. And a lot of that is attraction to shoot them. Let's just be honest. A lot of that is being able to get those turkeys out in the field and get them in front of the gun barrel, in addition to brood rearing. So when that production of brown top millet is there's that seed resource. But then the 2 and 3 years after that, it's brood recovery. You know what I mean? So, and that's just easier for a landowner sometimes to wrap their mind around. It's easier to accomplish those.
Yeah. Well, and it also is I think that there are probably a lot of landowners in a scenario where they don't want to give up all of their areas that they might use in food plot or something. So they may use a similar type of system where you're rotating what you're planting each year and using that to have that fallow, good brood rearing cover. But that's all contingent on you getting rid of the nasty stuff.
That's right.
Right, that you were talking about earlier.
And sometimes that millet production system, you can dove hunt that too, but sometimes that millet production system or some annual, it doesn't have to be brown top millet, actually does as good a job of getting the little odds and ends that you miss with your sprayer, some residual non-native, if you come in and do a little bit of disking and planting and all that. some of these plantings, we don't even amend. You don't soil test or anything. You're just basically sowing a planting to cover the soil quickly and smother out any of the aggressive weeds.
Which the brown top is really fast.
Oh yeah, just almost immediate. But yeah, no, that's there's just a couple of different systems, and it just all depends on. There's so many ways to do it. I know early on we were just cookbook, spray, burn, spray, plant, boom, next. But you really got to look at what the objectives are. One of the, I don't want to set people up. If their objective is turkeys and turkey hunting, they want to shoot a turkey in the face. And so having a ton of, I'll just go ahead and use the growed up fields out there makes hunting scenarios a little bit difficult. And so we got to make allowances for that as biologists and be able to have some places like you mentioned for the food plots, have some allowances for, it's a good reason to burn right there, just to get into, to improve hunting scenarios and all that. So I've seen people be unhappy with some of these management regimes because they didn't see turkeys in the spring like they wanted to. Now they saw broods all summer, but the currency.
There's definitely a balance there because you want to have a place to get the turkey in front of the barrel, but you also want to hear 10 on the roost.
That's right.
So we're kind of balancing those two.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.